Well, first today, just over a year since it was announced, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse finally gets underway today. The inquiry is set to examine how the country's institutions handled their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse. It starts at 10 this morning and we'll get more detail on exactly how the inquiry will be run. But just getting to today and the start of the inquiry has not been easy. Well, after the revelations about Jimmy Savile and the announcement of various public inquiries relating to his activities and institutionalised paedophilia, there were calls for an overarching national investigation into historical claims of child abuse throughout the first half of last year. Initially, the government resisted those calls. The Labour MP Simon Danshuk then called on a former Home Secretary, Lord Britton, to reveal what he knew about allegations of a paedophile ring amongst senior figures in the Westminster establishment during the 1980s. It had been alleged that Lord Britton, who's since died, may have been given a dossier relating to high-profile paedophiles, but that nothing had been done to investigate. Here's what Simon Danshuk said at the time.
If the dossier has been destroyed, people will think that names are trying to be protected, and that's the last thing that we want. We want to get to the bottom of this historic child sex abuse, and that means the Home Office coming clean with the information that they have.
With pressure growing from a large number of victims, MPs and organisations, the government announced an inquiry. Its remit is to investigate the way public bodies in England and Wales handled child sex abuse claims and to find out whether they did fail in their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation. There are separate inquiries dealing with Scotland and Northern Ireland. This is what Theresa May said when she announced the inquiry.
I know that in recent months, many members of the House from all parties have campaigned for an independent, overarching inquiry into historical allegations of child abuse. In my correspondence with the 7 members of Parliament who wrote to me about the campaign, the honourable members for Birmingham Yardley, Brighton Pavilion, East Worthing and Shoreham, Richmond Park, Rochdale, Wells and West Bromwich East, I made clear that the government did not rule out such an inquiry. I can now tell the House that the government will establish an independent inquiry panel of experts in the law and child protection to consider whether public bodies and other non-state institutions have taken seriously their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse. The inquiry panel will be chaired by an appropriately senior and experienced figure. It will begin its work as soon as possible after the appointment of the chairman and other members of the panel.
Well, the leadership of the inquiry has been mired in controversy almost since the day it was announced. Its first chair, the retired judge Baroness Butler-Sloss, resigned just a week after she was appointed, under pressure because her brother Sir Michael Havers served as the government's top lawyer in the 1980s. It's one of the key periods she was set to investigate. Next up was Fiona Woolf. She later stood down because victims' groups told the government they were unanimous that she should quit because of her social links with the ex-Home Secretary, Lord Britton. Here's what they both had to say after stepping aside, starting with Fiona Woolf.
It's about the victims. The victims' voices absolutely have to be heard, and because many of them are showing great courage in standing up and engaging with this process. I was determined that the inquiry got to the bottom of the issues for them, and if I don't command their confidence to run the panel fairly and impartially, then I need to get out of the way.
Yeah. When did you come to that decision? What tipped the balance?
It has been brewing for some time. Indeed, I mean, ever since the issues first arose, I've been worrying about the negative perceptions, and there's been lots of negative comment and innuendo, and that has been getting in the way as well. But you know, there were people saying, well, it is really difficult to find someone to do this job anyway. It's not a job that people relish taking on. But I just felt it was so incredibly important because we seem to be admiring the problem rather than dealing with it.
You need someone who knows how to run things. And if you get someone from an obscure background with no background of establishment, they'll find it very difficult and may not be able, actually, to produce the goods.
So now we're on to chair number 3. Following criticism of appointing people too close to the people and institutions they were investigating, the Home Secretary turned to this woman. She's Lowell Goddard and she's a High Court judge in New Zealand. So what more do we know about her? Well, she was the first person of Maori descent to become a High Court judge in her home country. In 2002, she sentenced a man who molested and stabbed to death his 2 stepdaughters in their beds to 28 years in prison, which was the country's longest imposed sentence since the abolition of the death penalty. She also served as chair of New Zealand's Independent Police Conduct Authority, and she oversaw an inquiry into police handling of child abuse cases in New Zealand. Here's what she said about taking on the job.
The age of a complaint or the age of evidence that you're trying to find is always a complicating factor in any forensic situation. So the further back you go, the more lost in the mists of time evidence can be. But putting a time frame around the inquiry in terms of how far back does it go is something that will have to be under discussion when I get to England.
Does it help to be somebody who isn't actually residing in England currently in terms of, you know, how far you are prepared to go and having no fear in this inquiry?
I think it helps enormously.
Why is that?
Well, I come with no context in terms of the inquiry itself. Certainly no agendas other than to work hard and get to the bottom of the allegations and to find answers for the survivors and for the government. But I think I can come, I suppose, as a fresh face and someone with no involvement at all in the life into which I will be inquiring.
Well, what about the cost of the inquiry? It has already cost a significant amount of money. According to figures on the inquiry website, it's already cost more than £1.2 million, and that is just between July, when the inquiry was established, and the end of March, so it doesn't even cover the period of Lowell Goddard's appointment. If you break down the figure, it amounts to just under £5,000 per day, and the inquiry hasn't even begun yet. Well, let's speak now to Keith Vaz, the Labour MP who chairs Parliament's Home Affairs Select Committee. Thanks for coming in and joining us. It's already cost £1.2 million, and we're expecting to hear from Lowell Goddard today that the overall cost is likely to go into tens of millions, and it's likely to take 5 years. Does that sound like value for money to you?
Well, the first thing to say, Joanna, is at last, after a year, and full credit to Theresa May for announcing the inquiry, we actually have a start to the inquiry. As you know, the process changed during the last year, and the Select Committee had an appointment hearing for Judge Goddard, and that was the right process to adopt. But of course there is concern about the cost so far, and it will rise. But the Home Secretary and I think Parliament as a whole have said that whatever it takes to get to the bottom of these very serious allegations, as this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to look at these historical cases, but also to set down parameters and criteria as to how local authorities and government and the police deal with it in the future. In a sense, it has to provide value for money. And of course, we wish her luck in the very difficult job that she's got, which could take up to 10 years. I mean, this is going to be a very long inquiry.
Up to 10 years?
Well, different figures have been put on it by different judges who've come before us. Fiona Woolf talked about a very long inquiry, but we would hope that it would be less than that, but we don't know. It's just starting.
As controversial as this, isn't time of the essence, actually, for the victims, and also in ensuring that lessons are learned and swiftly put in place?
Of course it is, and that's why we are glad that Judge Goddard has said it's important that the public authorities don't shred documents, that they keep everything for her inquiry. We were very keen when this process started that there should be an interim report. Perhaps she's going to tell us a little bit about that when she announces what she's going to do with this inquiry later on today. But I think it's important to have to let her get on with the job, let her hear from the witnesses, let that take its proper course. But I think it's a good idea to have an interim report at some stage, perhaps in a year's time, that will allow us to know where this inquiry is going. But we can't kind of put pull it to bits as to what it's going to do, because it's only just starting today.
I mean, it does sound like you're then saying that there needs to be a way of keeping tabs on this, because on the one hand you're saying whatever it takes, presumably you mean that in terms of the cost of it, and also saying it could take up to 10 years. But when you look at other inquiries, Bloody Sunday inquiry by Lord Savile, that cost £200 million. We've heard this year from David Cameron with his frustrations over the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. Cost £9 million, set up in 2009. Last heard from its witnesses in 2011. It's still not reported back. Patience starts to run thin at some stage, doesn't it? I mean, there can't be that blank check and open-ended time frame.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Joanna. That's why I think it's important to have an interim report so that we know where this is going. We also have the victims who will be very vocal and will have their own liaison committee and their own representatives to talk to the judge. I think the judge was made aware when she appeared before the Select Committee that Parliament was concerned to make sure that we got on with this issue, but also that we had some concrete proposals as soon as possible, because as you've said, it is going on at the moment, and therefore we need those guidelines, and we need to make sure that public authorities and others are aware of what she says. But we have great confidence in her. We were extremely impressed with the way in which she gave evidence and her record and her commitment. I mean, the government has literally gone to the ends of the earth in order to find someone to chair this inquiry, bearing in mind what's happened with the first two judges.
Couldn't have gone much further,
They couldn't have, no. I mean, obviously New Zealand think it itself is in the centre of the world, but of course we do here in the United Kingdom. So we wish her well, but of course it's important to get that scrutiny continuing, not necessarily from Parliament and the Home Affairs Select Committee. I think public opinion and the victims through their organisations will want to say a lot about what's going on.
She's reportedly looking to hire 21 barristers to help her run the inquiry, 10 of whom will be QCs, which sounds like an awful lot. What do you think about that?
It does sound like an awful lot.
And it'll be expensive. And
the trouble with other inquiries, you mentioned Savile quite correctly, half the cost, half the £200 million was actually the costs of lawyers. We must not make this...
And I think there are 4 times as many lawyers proposed for this one then.
There are, and that is, of course...
Does that give us a sense of how much it might end up costing?
Well, it causes concern, and it should not be seen to be an employment exchange, a job centre for lawyers. What this is about is an opportunity for the judge to do whatever she thinks is appropriate, and it is hoped that the costs will be providing value for money, as you said, but also that they don't go overboard in terms of legal representatives. After all, this is about ordinary people coming forward and speaking truth about what's happened to them.
And in essence, for you, what is the value of this inquiry, in that there are other inquiries and investigations already underway into, I think, probably most of the elements individually that this inquiry will be looking at? What does bringing everything together under one overarching inquiry achieve?
What it achieves is certainty and focus. At the moment, there are a whole series of allegations about different people, institutions, about the way in which police have handled issues, the church. Here we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to look at all these matters and to put down some very effective guidelines as to what should happen in the future. And as she has said, if there is examples of criminality, then she will take the necessary course and no doubt refer it to the DPP for action. But this is that big opportunity, so it's a big thing that's happening with this inquiry. Parliament has asked for it over a period of time. Individual victims at the centre of this, of course, should be the victims. So when you're talking about who should be employed as lawyers, I think it's really important that the victims have their own counsel before the judge. But this is her inquiry. She must decide how she wants to conduct it, but she needs to come back with some information, I think, in due course, an interim report which will help Parliament and the public know where it's going.
Keith Vaz, thank you. Now to that independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. It's finally getting underway this morning, 1 year after it was first announced. The inquiry is set to examine how the country's institutions handled their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse. The Honourable Lowell Goddard is the 3rd chair to be appointed and will set out what format the inquiry will take. Well, we can speak now to 2 abuse victims. Phil Frampton from White Flowers Campaign Group joins us from Salford, and we're joined here in the studio studio by Phil Johnson, who's from Ministers and Clergy Sexual Abuse Survivors. Thank you both very much for joining us. Phil, in the studio, first of all, as this inquiry gets underway, what are your hopes and expectations?
Well, I'm very glad that it's actually finally getting underway. It's been, a very long, hard struggle and a lot of campaigning by people like Phil and myself and many, many others to get this far. I mean, there have been false starts, it's been a very rocky road, but I hope that now we can look forward to it actually doing some proper investigative work and getting to the truth to try and get justice for survivors.
Phil, it's been a long time coming. How do you feel today?
Well, you just have to remember that 1 year ago, myself and Phil were in the media campaigning to remove Butler Sloss. Then there was another campaign where we were campaigning to remove Fiona Woolf as chairs of the inquiry. We've had battles over insisting that it be a statutory inquiry, insisting that they remove the 1970 rule. We've had battles over the issue of transparency and no one on the inquiry having conflicts of interest. So we've got to this stage now. It still needs a strong, unfettered voice for survivors. And because we have still major problems in the sense that while the panel now is has 4 members, there's no member of the no survivor on that panel, or no disclosed survivor, and they were distinctly barred by we were distinctly barred by Goddard from being on that panel. And 2 of the members of the panel are in effect people who are long-term employees or executives in areas which were part of the problem. That was the Home Office with Drusilla Sharpling and Alexis Jay, who's been a long-standing senior social work executive. So it's a bit of an unbalanced panel, which creates a problem, and that's why we need a strong, unfettered voice for survivors. And that's why White Flowers and survivors of organised and institutional abuse are fighting for, or campaigning for, and negotiating with the inquiry over securing core participation in the inquiry, so we can ensure that survivors have full access to the material and have full ability to question, or survivors' representatives, legal representatives, have full access to material and full ability to question witnesses.
Well, while we talk to you, actually, the inquiry is just beginning, so let's just take a quick look at what is happening there. And there you can see Justice Lowell Goddard just with her opening remarks. She's just outlining what the scope of the inquiry will be. And Phil Johnson, I spoke to Keith Vaz a little earlier. He said potentially this could take up to 10 years, cost tens of millions of pounds. The cost aside, what about a time frame like that? Would that be acceptable to you?
I think it will have to take as long as it takes. I don't think that very many people in British society realise just the scale and scope of child abuse in our society, and the extent to which it's been covered up by institutions, and the failings of the authorities through social services, through the care home system, through churches and the police and investigators. Just how the lack of resources that's been given to actually truly uncovering what's happened. How
important a moment is this for victims? I mean, you talk obviously about so many institutions. Some have been better than others at handling what has gone on. What have your experiences been? Well, my experiences personally have been terrible. I mean, I've been through 3 previous independent inquiries, which were supposedly independent, but they were set up by the churches, which were the institutions in which I was abused. So each one of those has been challenged and has led to another inquiry. So it's very important that we get to a full, proper, statutory independent inquiry, which is what we're on the brink of at the moment. I agree with Phil to a large extent about survivor representation. It's very important. The survivors are the experts in this. We cannot trust the institutions to hand over all the evidence, because as has happened in the churches in the past, a lot of the most incriminating evidence has been destroyed or lost. So it's very important that survivors are represented. We have now the VSCP, Victim and Survivors Consultative Panel, who the appointees are being announced today. They are currently negotiating their own terms
of reference for their role within the inquiry. That is our voice at the moment. So it's important that people like Phil and I liaise very closely with them, lobby them, work with them to try and get survivors' voices heard by the inquiry panel and by Justice Goddard.
Phil, tell us more about the White Flowers campaign group and what your experiences have been.
Well, White Flowers, as I said, was to the fore in campaigning to actually get to the inquiry, even to the stage where it's been now. But we still feel there are huge conflicts of interest in there. We particularly objected to Goddard's removal of any survivors from the panel on the basis that they lacked objectivity. And once she did that, and in effect, really, to be honest, smeared, I think she will regret those words now, but effectively smeared survivors, all survivors, when she said that. What she in effect said was that the victim and survivors panel was really like a bit like the children's table at the dinner party, I'm afraid, to contradict Phil on that. And it's clear that they won't have full access to material, they won't have full ability to question people. It wasn't even clear when the panel was set up what their role would be. It wasn't made clear to them even that what their role would be, and that's why we need a strong, unfettered voice, which will not be the VSCP. It will be through survivors and their legal representatives through core participation.
Phil, I don't want to cut across you, but what I was thinking actually was sort of just going one step back even from the point that we're at now, and the fact that you set up a campaign group, or you're involved with a campaign group. The fact that so many campaign groups have been set up is indicative of what people like both of you have been fighting for so many years, and what you're talking about. It has not been an easy journey, obviously, so just sort of take us back through that and what you have encountered along the way.
Well, I was on the select committee. I was a witness to the select committee back in 2001 with in Home Affairs Select Committee into police investigations into police homes, and then that was a time when it was just care leavers like myself and care leaver survivors who were pushing for justice on this issue. And we were isolated. We were called legal treasure hunters by people on that select committee. One of the people on the select committee, incidentally, was David Cameron, and we were effectively derided. Well, even the police said that the paedophile rings were probably something which were just media creations, and as a result, we were derided in the public, denigrated in the media, whereas actually many of those politicians knew exactly what the truth was, and many of those police knew exactly what the truth was. So it's been a long, long journey for many of us. In White Flowers, we have people who have been battling for 20 to 30 years on the issue of child protection and on the issue of justice for survivors, and to bring abusers to justice. So when this inquiry started, we had great hope, but we also were aware that if there were conflicts of interest, there would be a serious problem with it. What we've tried to do is bring together all those campaigners. In January, we had a major meeting in the House of Commons with MPs, child protection workers, lawyers, people who've written about the issue, survivors, survivor support mechanisms, to bring people together to have a view. And it's because we do recognise there's all sorts of talent out there, and skill and experience in there, which can be brought to bear. The people know the situation. We've got 10 to 11 million survivors of child abuse in this country, according to the NSPCC. It's a vast problem, as Phil has said. And this inquiry of itself will only do the job, we feel, because of our experience, especially with governments, over where there have been time and time again, there have been major problems in relation to the governments and the machinery taking the issue seriously, that we have to get at that issue first. It's what's happened at the top of the state machinery which is most important here. Otherwise,
we hear you loud and clear, Phil. You obviously, you feel like you've been cheated so many times. You both do. You're both obviously very strong to fight, but getting to this point clearly will not have been easy. Just tell us how this has defined you. I mean, does this dominate your life now, Phil?
Well, it does, unfortunately. I mean, I've said in interviews and things before that, you know, when you ask a child what they want to be when they grow up, nobody says, I want to be a professional survivor of child abuse. You know, it's not something you want, but it does define your life. And those of us who are robust enough, like Phil and myself, to be able to campaign and stand up to society and the authorities, I think we have a duty to do so, and I think that it's a way of putting the horrendous experiences of our past to positive use and helping other people. One, you know, really important factor in this inquiry is, you know, I would encourage survivors to come forward and tell their stories. They are the experts. They're the people who know the truth. There are many people in authorities who are going to want to cover things up and hide them. It's crucial that the survivors tell their truths.
So if there's somebody at home potentially watching who feels like they've not spoken about something, how hard is it for that person to come forward?
It can be incredibly hard, and it can be very re-traumatising, and, you know, there are people who have taken their lives over this. People who are in prisons, who have drug and alcohol problems, people who, you know, are in mental institutions. So it's crucial that the inquiry, the panel, the secretariat ensure that there's adequate support for people. So there's counselling support, whatever support they require, really, and that needs to be adequately funded. Now, I know this inquiry is going to be very, very expensive, but, you know, what price do you put on protecting our children and ensuring this doesn't continue to happen in the future? So yes, I think it will be troubling, it will be difficult for people, it will be traumatic, but we need to continue to campaign to make sure that these people are supported, and hopefully they will get truth and justice without having to suffer anymore.
Phil Johnson from Minister and Clergy Sexual Abuse Survivors, and Phil Frampton, Chair of White Flowers Campaign Group. Thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's go back to that independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. It's opened today, just over a year after it was announced by the Home Secretary Theresa May. The Honourable Lowell Goddard is the third chair to be appointed, and in the last hour she's been laying out how the format of the inquiry will unfold. Well, Tom Simons is outside the building in central London where the inquiry is getting underway. What's she said so far, Tom?
Well, Joanna, there's been a lot of disquiet among people following this inquiry that not much has been said about how it will do its work. Well, today they've got chapter and verse from the woman running the inquiry, Justice Lowell Goddard, a New Zealand judge who's given up 5 years of her life at least to come over here and chair this inquiry. So what did she say? Well, she said that the inquiry would confront those responsible, uncover systematic failures, support victims, and she said the task ahead of her was daunting. The abuse, she said, had left permanent scars on individuals and on society as a whole. Now, she cited one piece of research that suggested that 1 in 20 children had been abused, and she said a significant number of those children say that they reported their abuse over the last 5 or 6 decades to institutions and had been let down by institutions who were there to protect them. She said this, and it was quite a big statement: we must travel from the corridors of power in Westminster to schools, hospitals, police courts, media, armed forces and charities to get to the truth. She said that she had the tools, she would not hesitate to use them, and this, no one, no matter how apparently powerful, will be allowed to obstruct our investigations, and no one, she said, will have immunity. Now, the problem for the inquiry is that it's so big. And she's been setting out in the last few minutes exactly how the work will be broken down, starting with the first theme, which will be allegations of abuse by prominent people in public life, people like politicians and celebrities. That will obviously be some of the most sensitive work that this inquiry does. And she also says that they will not be able to look at every single case in investigatory detail, so they'll pick out cases. And if they find evidence potentially of criminality, that, Joanna, will be passed to the police.
Thank you, Tom.
The independent inquiry into historical child sexual abuse in England and Wales has opened nearly a year after it was first announced. It will examine how public bodies handle their duty of care to protect children from abuse. The inquiry's chairwoman, the New Zealand judge Lowell Goddard, used a speech to set out its scope and structure.
The task ahead of us is daunting. The sexual abuse of children over successive generations has left permanent scars, not only on the victims themselves, but on society as a whole. This inquiry provides a unique opportunity to expose past failures of institutions to protect children, to confront those responsible, to uncover systemic failures, to provide support to victims and survivors in sharing their experiences, and to make recommendations that will help prevent the sexual abuse and exploitation of children in the future.
Justice Lowell Goddard speaking at the opening of the inquiry.